Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. On the day that should have been my 66th birthday celebration, my daughter-in-law laughed that I could disappear and no one would miss me, and my own son stood silent. That night, while their voices carried through the kitchen door, I heard them whisper about remodeling my home once I was gone. I had spent 43 years building that house with my late husband, paying every bill alone after he passed, and in that moment I knew I was no longer a mother to them, but only a deed to be claimed. The next morning I began writing a letter that would not only shatter their plan, but also give me back my dignity. The afternoon sun hung warm over Raleigh when I walked up the driveway to my son's suburban home, balancing a glass dish wrapped carefully in a towel. Inside was my apple pie, the one I had baked every birthday since Daniel was a boy. The yard smelled of charcoal and grilled meat laughter drifting from the patio where guests gathered with plates in hand. Balloons in shades of blue and silver bobbed gently in the breeze tied to the back fence. It was my 66th birthday, and Daniel had insisted that the celebration be at his house. Lauren greeted me at the door, her blonde hair shining, her smile practiced. She glanced at the pie, then at me. I held it up, forcing cheer into my voice. My famous apple pie, Daniel's favorite. She accepted it with a tight grin and muttered that it was a little too sweet for her taste, but set it down on the counter anyway. I noticed she had arranged a store-bought cake pristine in its plastic box already positioned as the centerpiece. Inside the house buzzed with voices. My granddaughter Emma, now 14, darted past me with a soda in hand. She gave me a quick hug before running back to her friends. Luke, just 11, waved shyly from the corner where he was showing a new game on his phone to another boy. Daniel came from the grill in the backyard, a spatula still in his hand. He kissed my cheek, smelling of smoke and seasoning, and said he was glad I made it. For a moment, I believed him. I followed him outside where the long table was covered with bowls of coleslaw chips and trays of burgers waiting to be cooked. Nancy Peterson, the neighbor, lifted her glass toward me. "Happy birthday, Margaret." She called, her voice warm. I thanked her, settling into a chair near the edge of the group. The air was full of chatter. Lauren stood near the grill, glass of wine in hand, leading a conversation about a colleague who had just bought a vacation home in Charleston. Her tone carried over everyone else, light but edged with superiority. I busied myself helping Luke untangle the kite string he had brought, listening without trying to. At first the words seemed harmless, the kind of casual gossip people let slip at gatherings. But then Lauren's voice rose again, playful, carrying laughter with it. "Honestly, Margaret, you could disappear and no one would miss you. You barely leave that little house anyway." For a moment time stalled. The clink of ice in glasses, the hiss of meat on the grill, even the hum of cicadas seemed to fade. Daniel chuckled weakly, a couple of others gave uncomfortable laughs. No one spoke up to defend me. My own son stood with his hand on the grill lid, eyes averted, as if the words had floated past unheard. I felt Emma's eyes flick toward me, quick and uncertain, before she bent back down to her phone. Luke's smile faded, but he said nothing. I forced my lips into a small nod, as if the comment had been a harmless joke. My hands pressed together in my lap, knuckles whitening. The conversation shifted, people talking again about vacations and recipes. I sat quietly, my heart heavy. I had endured little slights before, but this cut deeper. I stared at the pie cooling on the counter through the window, the same pie that had once made Daniel beam as a child, and wondered when it had become too sweet too much, or simply unwanted. Later, when the crowd thinned and children had retreated to the yard, I stepped inside to wash my hands. Passing the hallway, I slowed at the sound of voices. The kitchen door was slightly ajar. Daniel's voice, low and serious, floated through. "We'll remodel after Mom is gone. It will raise the value a lot." Lauren answered lighter, almost excited. "I've already talked to Mike about the kitchen. He says once we have the deed in our names, it'll be easy." My breath caught. The dish towel in my hand slipped to the floor. I stood still, pulse pounding. Their words were not meant for me, but each syllable cut sharp. Gone. Deed. Remodel. My house. The one Robert and I had built a life in, the one I had kept, after his passing, paid for every month until the mortgage was clear. I stepped back quietly, pretending to adjust my bag as someone walked past me. My face remained calm, but inside something shifted. This was not only a cruel remark at a barbecue. This was a plan, an expectation that I would simply vanish, leaving everything behind for them to take. I walked back outside, the laughter rising again as the last burgers were served. The smell of smoke lingered in the air. I smiled faintly when Nancy handed me a plate, but the taste of food turned to ash in my mouth. I watched Daniel pour a drink, watched Lauren fix her hair in the reflection of the patio door. I saw my family, my own blood, already counting what they believed would be theirs. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the lawn, I placed my fork down and folded my napkin. My voice stayed light as I thanked Daniel and Lauren for hosting, as if I had not heard a thing. Inside, though, the decision had already begun to take root. When I left their house that evening, the air had cooled. I walked slowly down the driveway, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. I carried the empty pie dish in one hand, the weight of silence in the other, and in my chest grew the quiet certainty that something in me had just changed forever. The night after the barbecue, I lay awake in my quiet house on Pinecrest Drive, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above me. The words I had overheard kept replaying louder each time. Remodel after Mom is gone. Deed in our names. My chest ached with a heaviness that had nothing to do with age. I thought of Robert and how he had worked weekends and late nights to pay down the mortgage, how we celebrated the day we mailed the last check. That house was not just wood and brick, it was every sacrifice we had made together. In the days that followed, I tried to push the memory aside, convincing myself maybe I had misheard. I baked bread for the church social, weeded the rose beds in my yard, visited the grocery store where the cashier always asked about my grandchildren. Yet the words lingered sharp and cutting. Each time I looked at the framed deed locked in my file cabinet, I felt a chill. One afternoon, I drove over to Daniel and Lauren's to drop off a jacket Luke had left behind. Their driveway was cluttered with paint samples and garden catalogs scattered on the hood of Lauren's car. Through the open window, I heard her voice, crisp and professional, speaking on her phone. She was talking to someone named Mike about granite countertops, open concept kitchens, and the best time to schedule demolition. My stomach twisted. She was not talking about her own home. She was describing mine. I stood frozen with the jacket draped over my arm, listening as she laughed softly, saying once the paperwork was sorted, the project could move quickly. The words stung, and I realized with sickening clarity that she was planning changes as if my house were already hers. The next week, I attended a local real estate open house invited by Nancy, who thought I might enjoy looking at how people staged their homes these days. I walked through the rooms filled with candles and polished furniture, but my attention caught when I overheard Lauren's unmistakable voice near the refreshment table. She was talking to another realtor, her tone full of excitement. She bragged that soon a property on Pinecrest would be in her hands, that she and her husband were simply waiting for the right time. I felt the air leave my lungs. She was speaking about my home in public as if I were already gone. I left quickly, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. Rage and sorrow battled inside me, but beneath it all, there was a cold, hard clarity. This was no misunderstanding. Lauren was not just careless with her words at a barbecue. She had a plan, and Daniel had chosen silence, maybe even complicity. That evening, I called Emma to check in. Her voice was distracted, but she softened when I asked about her art project. "Grandma, Mom says when you move out of your old house, we might get to have a pool at our place." I paused, trying to keep my tone steady as I told her I had no plans of leaving. Her innocent words confirmed what I already knew. They had been planting seeds even in the minds of the children. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the floral wallpaper Robert had insisted we keep, even when it went out of style. My hands rested flat on the table. For years, I had allowed myself to believe that enduring small cruelties was the price of keeping family close. But now the price had risen to something I could not pay. They wanted my home the only piece of security I had left. The next time I visited Daniel's, I knocked lightly before stepping inside. Lauren was in the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. She smiled thinly at me, holding up a finger as she kept talking. "Mike, yes, the foundation is solid," she said. "The living room can be opened up, the master bedroom extended. Once the deed is transferred, we will move quickly." I set the cookies I had baked on the counter, my face neutral though my pulse raced. She ended the call and thanked me politely, but her eyes gave nothing away. Driving home, I noticed how the maples lining Pinecrest were beginning to turn the first signs of autumn. The house appeared sturdy and timeless against the fading light. Inside, the smell of old books and lemon polish greeted me, comforting and familiar. I ran my hand over the banister Robert had sanded smooth decades ago. The thought of it being torn apart, remodeled for someone else's vision, filled me with grief and anger. That night I could not sleep. I walked from room to room, touching the frames on the walls, the quilt folded at the foot of my bed, the ceramic lamp Robert bought on a trip to Asheville. Each item whispered of years of life lived here, of moments no one else could ever understand. And yet in the minds of my own family, I was already erased. The next Sunday at church, Nancy sat beside me, her hymnal open. She leaned closer after the service. "Margaret, I overheard something odd at the open house last week. Lauren was talking about your place on Pinecrest as if it were already hers." I nodded slowly, my throat tight. "Thank you, Nancy," I said. Her eyes held sympathy, but also a quiet warning. I returned home with the echo of Nancy's words following me. The pieces had formed a whole picture, one I could no longer deny. They were not just waiting for me to grow old quietly. They were planning to take what Robert and I had built with our hands and sacrifices. As I stood in the front yard that afternoon, the September wind tugging at my sweater, I looked at the windows of my house reflecting the sky. For the first time, I felt not just sadness, but resolve. I would not let them strip me away from the life I had forged. They saw me as weak, invisible, a woman to be brushed aside. They were wrong. The street was quiet except for the sound of leaves skittering across the pavement. I locked the front door firmly behind me, the key cool in my hand. Something inside me shifted from despair to determination. The house was mine, and if they wanted to make it a prize in their plans, then I would have to decide how to protect it. I sat at the table once more, pen poised above an empty notebook, the silence of the house wrapping around me. Their voices echoed in my memory: Lauren's laughter, Daniel's easy silence, the casual certainty that I would be gone. My hand trembled slightly as I began to write, not yet knowing what shape my plan would take, but certain that the time of passive endurance was over. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking the beginning of a change I could no longer postpone. The next morning, I sat in my living room surrounded by the faded patterns of the sofa Robert and I had chosen years ago. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching dust motes in the air, and for a moment I felt as though time itself had stopped. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. I opened the old photo album resting on my lap. There were pictures of Daniel as a baby Robert, holding him proudly in front of this very fireplace, and later snapshots of birthdays and graduations. As the pages turned, I noticed what had been gnawing at me all along. In the older photos, I was there, smiling, present in every moment. But in the more recent ones, especially after Lauren came into the family, my face appeared less and less. Sometimes I was cropped out completely, as if I had been erased. A sharp vibration on the coffee table pulled me from my thoughts. My phone lit up with a message, and without my glasses, I squinted at the words. It was from Lauren. She must have sent it by mistake. Do not forget to file the loan application using Mom's house. My breath caught the phone trembling in my hand. The words were there in black and white, undeniable. It was not just careless talk or wishful thinking. They intended to use my home as leverage for their plans, and they assumed I would be too blind or too weak to stop them. I sank back into the cushions, the phone still glowing in my palm, a deep ache spreading through my chest. Images of Robert filled my mind, his tired but determined smile when we made that final mortgage payment in 2010. He had always said that this house would be my security, my safe place, no matter what. Now his promise felt threatened by the very people I had loved and sacrificed for. By evening, I could no longer sit in silence. I picked up the phone and dialed Ruth Collins, the only person I trusted with something this heavy. Ruth had been my neighbor 30 years ago, before she moved to downtown Raleigh, and over the years she had become my confidant. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and steady. Margaret, is everything all right? I swallowed hard, trying to find my words. Ruth, I need to see you. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today, if possible. There was a pause on the line. I hear something in your voice, she said softly. Come by my office in the morning. We will talk everything through. I thanked her and set the phone down, my hands still shaking. That night, I moved through the house, slowly running my fingers over the wooden banister Robert had smoothed with sandpaper opening drawers, filled with linens my mother had embroidered. Each object felt like a goodbye. I did not cry. Instead, I felt a growing certainty, like a stone settling into place. The next morning, the drive to Ruth's office seemed longer than usual. Her building stood near the courthouse, a brick structure with ivy climbing its walls. I parked and walked in, clutching my handbag tightly. Ruth rose from behind her desk when I entered, her gray hair tucked neatly into a bun, glasses perched low on her nose. She pulled me into a gentle hug before leading me to a chair. Tell me what happened, Margaret. I told her everything. The barbecue, the overheard whispers, the contractor, and finally the message I had received by mistake. As I spoke, her eyes sharpened, her pen tapping lightly on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back, folding her hands together. This is serious, she said. But it is not hopeless. The deed is in your name alone, correct? Yes. Robert made sure of that before he passed. Then here is what I recommend. You sell the house on your terms before they can use it as collateral or trick you into signing anything. We will create a trust for your grandchildren so the money cannot be touched by Daniel or Lauren. It will belong to Emma and Luke directly when they are of age. Her words stunned me not for their boldness, but for the sudden sense of freedom they offered. I had spent so long reacting to their treatment shrinking to keep the peace. Now, Ruth was handing me a way to act to protect what Robert and I had built. But Ruth, I whispered, my throat tight, this is my home. Ruth reached across the desk, her eyes kind but firm. Margaret, a home is more than walls. They have already made this place unsafe for you. Selling it will not erase your memories. It will give you the power to decide what comes next. I nodded slowly, tears blurring my vision. She was right. Holding on to the house would not bring Robert back, and staying would only give Daniel and Lauren more chances to corner me. We spent the next hour going over documents. Ruth outlined how the sale would work, how the trust could be structured, and what protections would be built in. Every detail tightened the knot of resolve in my chest. By the time I left her office, the sun was shining bright against the courthouse steps, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Control. Driving home, I stopped at a small diner for lunch, staring out the window at the bustle of downtown Raleigh. People hurried past carrying briefcases and coffee cups, each with their own worries. For the first time in a long while, mine no longer felt insurmountable. When I pulled into my driveway, the house loomed ahead, familiar and heavy with memories. I sat in the car for several minutes just looking. The siding Robert had painted himself, the shutters he had repaired after a storm, the flower bed I planted every spring. Soon it would belong to someone else, but the choice would be mine. Inside, I began to gather the things that truly mattered. Robert's watch tucked in a velvet box, the quilt my grandmother had made, letters Daniel had written me from college before his tone changed. I placed them carefully into a suitcase, each item reminding me that love and loss had filled this house, but also that strength had carried me through before. As night fell, I sat at my desk with a fresh sheet of paper. My pen hovered, the words forming slowly in my mind. This was not just about property. It was about my dignity, my independence, and the message I wanted to leave behind. I would not be erased. I would not hand over my life's work quietly. The grandfather clock chimed 9 as I pressed the pen to paper, beginning the first lines of what would become the letter that changed everything. I woke early the next morning with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that made each breath feel like it carried the weight of years. The house was quiet, only the creak of the floorboards under my slippers and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee, staring at the phone, still holding Lauren's mistaken message. The words about filing the loan application with my house as collateral burned on the screen. I knew I could not ignore it any longer. By mid-morning, I had gathered enough courage to call Ruth. Her voice was steady as always, a comfort, even through the phone line. She told me to come by her office on Fayetteville Street that afternoon. I drove into downtown Raleigh, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Her office was on the second floor of an old brick building, ivy climbing the sides, the brass plaque on the door polished to a shine. When I stepped inside, she rose from behind her desk and gave me a hug. The warmth in that simple gesture nearly broke me, but I swallowed hard and sat down across from her. I laid everything out, each detail of what I had heard at the barbecue, the overheard call with the contractor, and finally the message meant for Daniel. As I spoke, Ruth's expression grew sharper, her eyes narrowing, her pen scribbling notes. When I finished, the silence stretched. Finally, she set her pen down. "Margaret, it is worse than I expected, but we have options. The deed is in your name alone, correct?" "Yes." "Robert and I paid it off in 2010. My name is the only one on it." "Then you hold all the power here," she said, leaning forward. "But you must act before they find a way to manipulate you into signing something. If they are already discussing loans, time is not on your side." My hands twisted in my lap. What can I do? You can sell the house on your own terms. The market is strong right now. You will have the freedom to move where you choose. And the proceeds can go into a trust for Emma and Luke. That way the money will belong to them directly outside their parents' reach. The idea hit me like a cold wind and a ray of sunlight at the same time. The thought of leaving the home Robert and I built together pierced me, but the vision of Lauren and Daniel stripping it apart for granite counters and open floor plans filled me with something darker than grief. Ruth's plan was bold, but it was the only way to keep control. I asked her what it would involve, how quickly it could be done. She explained step by step, her voice calm and methodical. I would need to sign listing agreements, grant her power of attorney for certain documents, and begin sorting what I wished to take with me. She would ensure every step was airtight, every signature witnessed, so no one could question my state of mind later. By the time I left her office, the decision had settled inside me like a stone. It was not about revenge, though the thought of shocking Lauren gave me a bitter satisfaction. It was about survival, about reclaiming the voice I had lost for so many years. When I returned home the late afternoon, light slanted across the front yard. I walked slowly through each room, touching the furniture, the walls, the little imperfections that told the story of our family. The dent in the hallway baseboard where Daniel had crashed his toy truck. The scratch on the dining table from Emma's first art project. Memories lived in these walls, but I realized memories did not need drywall and shingles to exist. I fetched 2 suitcases from the closet and began filling them with the things that mattered most. Robert's watch tucked in a velvet case, the quilt my grandmother sewed by hand, a shoebox of letters tied with ribbon Daniel's handwriting from college days when he still saw me as his anchor. Family photographs, even the ones where my smiles seemed smaller because they were still proof of the life I had lived. As I folded sweaters into the suitcase, my hands steadied. Each item placed inside was a declaration. I would leave behind what could be replaced. I would not leave behind my dignity. The following day, Ruth called with news. She had already contacted a realtor. She trusted a woman named Susan with a reputation for discretion and efficiency. The house could be listed quietly, and with the market the way it was, it would not take long. Ruth assured me she would handle every call, every showing, shielding me from the inevitable fallout until the sale was complete. I thanked her, my throat tight, and hung up the phone. Then I walked into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, where Daniel had done his homework on the counter while I stirred pots on the stove. I pulled out a pad of paper and began making lists, items to keep, people to notify, accounts to close. As night settled over the neighborhood, I sat at the desk in the front room. Outside, the maple tree creaked softly in the breeze, the same sound Robert had always promised to trim but never quite did. I opened the drawer and pulled out fresh stationery. At the top I wrote the words, "To Daniel and Lauren." I stared at the page, the pen heavy in my hand. The letter would not be finished that night, but the beginning was there. It would carry the truth they refused to hear, the final proof that I was not as invisible as they believed. When the clock struck 10, I folded the blank page back into the drawer and turned off the lamp. My suitcases waited in the corner half filled, but already feeling lighter than the burden I had carried for years. I climbed into bed knowing that the path had been set. The house would no longer be their prize. It would be my choice, my escape, and my last act of protection for the grandchildren who still looked at me with love. At night, the house seemed to breathe with me, each creak of the floorboards echoing through the stillness. I sat at my desk in the front room with only a lamp for light. A blank sheet of paper lay in front of me, the pen heavy in my hand. The words refused to come at first. My mind kept drifting to images of Robert sanding the porch railing or Daniel as a boy running across the yard barefoot. I wiped at my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and pressed the tip of the pen to the page. The first draft was clumsy, too emotional, filled with sentences that sounded more like a plea than a statement. I tore it in half, let the pieces fall into the wastebasket, and started again. The second time I wrote slowly, each word chosen carefully. I did not want it to read like a cry for help. It had to be clear, final, undeniable. Night after night, I returned to the desk writing and rewriting. Some evenings I would stop to walk the halls, pausing at framed photos. There was Daniel at 5 years old holding his first baseball glove, his cheeks flushed with pride. There was Robert on our 30th anniversary, his arm around me as we smiled for the camera. Looking at those faces steadied me. I was not doing this to hurt them, I told myself. I was doing it to keep them from destroying the last gift Robert and I had worked for together. Finally, the words began to settle into place. I wrote that the house had been sold legally through my own decision and with full understanding of every document I signed. I detailed the amount $480,000 and how it had been placed into a trust. The trust was for Emma and Luke alone to be accessed when they reached adulthood. I added that the funds could not be touched or redirected by their parents, not under any circumstance. I paused there, my hand trembling. I imagined Emma opening this letter someday, realizing her grandmother had fought for her, even when the adults around her were consumed with control. That thought gave me strength to keep writing. Toward the end of the letter, I added the line that had haunted me since I began. This house was never yours to claim. It has always been mine, and now it will pass on my terms. I read those words aloud, my voice quivering at first, then stronger. They rang through the room with a kind of finality I had not felt in years. For the first time in a long while, I was no longer shrinking into silence. I tucked the finished draft into a folder, but when I tried to sleep, I found myself restless. What if the tone was too harsh? What if Daniel read it and hardened against me forever? But then the memory of Lauren's laughter at the barbecue rose up, her voice cutting through me like a knife. You could disappear, and no one would miss you. I sat upright in bed and knew there could be no compromise. Over the following days, I polished the letter, adjusting, phrasing, cutting unnecessary words. Ruth helped me add legal language confirming that all transactions were witnessed and documented. She assured me the letter would stand as a formal statement, not just a personal note. Together, we included copies of the trust documents notarized and signed, so there could be no doubt. In between drafts, I moved through the house collecting what I would carry with me. Robert's watch, the quilt folded at the end of the bed, the little ceramic bird that Emma once gave me for Christmas. Each object carried a memory, and as I packed them away, I whispered promises that I would not let them be swallowed by greed. One evening, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood was quiet, only the sound of crickets and the occasional car passing. I thought of the nights Robert and I had sat on this very porch swing talking about retirement dreams. He had always wanted to take me back to the coast where we had honeymooned. I smiled through tears, realizing that in some way by leaving, I was honoring him at last. When the letter was finally sealed in an envelope, I held it for a long time in my hands. It felt heavier than paper should. Inside it carried every silent hurt, every small dismissal, and now every ounce of my defiance. It was not written to win back love or respect. It was written to set boundaries that had never been honored. I placed the envelope in the drawer of my desk, along with duplicates that Ruth would keep in her files. The lamp on the desk flickered as if the house itself knew something was ending. I closed the drawer gently and stood a calm settling over me that felt almost foreign. The house around me was the same, the walls painted in the same faded tones, the grandfather clock ticking in its corner. But within me, something had shifted. I was no longer just waiting for the next insult, the next reminder of invisibility. I had drawn a line. That night, as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, the suitcase waiting by the bedroom door seemed less like a burden and more like a key. I was not running away. I was preparing to step into a future of my own making. The letter would remain behind, a truth carved into ink and paper, ready to speak for me long after I was gone from this house. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, the letter sealed and waiting my decision no longer just a thought, but a reality. The morning air was cool when I stepped onto the porch with 2 suitcases at my feet. The maple tree in the yard shifted in the breeze, branches scratching against the roof the way Robert always said he would trim, but never did. I paused at the doorway, looking once more at the rooms that had held my life for 43 years. The scent of lemon polish lingered in the kitchen, the quilt folded neatly on the couch waited where I had left it. I set 3 envelopes on the dining table, each labeled in my careful handwriting. One for Daniel and Lauren, one for Emma and Luke, and one for Nancy Peterson next door, who had been more of a family to me than my own son in recent years. When the taxi pulled into the driveway, the engine rumbling low, I lifted the suitcases by their worn handles and carried them outside. The driver, a man in his 40s with kind eyes, stepped out to help. "Heading to the station, ma'am." I knotted my throat tight and slid into the back seat. As we drove through Raleigh, I pressed my forehead against the window. I watched familiar landmarks slip by, the church where Robert and I had married, the park where Daniel had once played Little League, the grocery store where I had spent countless Saturdays. Every place carried a memory, and yet none of them felt like home anymore. My phone buzzed in my purse once, then again, then over and over until it became a relentless vibration. I pulled it out and saw Lauren's name flashing across the screen. The messages stacked one after another. "We need you to sign authorization. Call me immediately. You cannot make decisions like this on your own." My finger hovered over the screen. For a moment I thought of answering, thought of unleashing every word I had held back for years. Instead, I powered the phone off. The silence that followed deep and liberating. At the station, the driver helped me with my bags, tipping his hat as I thanked him. The building smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. I bought a one-way ticket to Wilmington, the coastal town where Robert and I had spent our honeymoon nearly 50 years ago. The clerk handed me the ticket without a glance, unaware of the weight it carried. On the platform, I set my suitcases down and sat on a bench. A young couple stood nearby, holding hands, their laughter light and easy. An older man leaned on his cane, waiting quietly. I felt strangely both invisible and completely alive, a woman beginning again when most would expect her to fade quietly into the background. When the train arrived, I boarded and found a window seat. As the cars lurched forward, Raleigh began to slip away. The houses blurred, the streets gave way to rolling fields, then to stretches of pine forest. I felt the knot in my chest loosen with each mile. I had not told Daniel or Lauren where I was going. I wanted it that way. For once, I was not accountable to their demands or their timelines. The rhythm of the train soothed me. I thought of Robert beside me, his arm draped around my shoulder the way he had done on our honeymoon trip to the coast. I closed my eyes and allowed the sway of the car to carry me back to that time, the smell of salt in the air, the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Hours passed before the announcement called out Wilmington. I gathered my bags and stepped onto the platform, greeted by the briny tang of ocean air carried inland on the breeze. The town was smaller than Raleigh, quieter, but alive with its own rhythm. Colorful storefronts lined the streets, cafes with chalkboard menus, a bookstore with faded awnings, people strolling with dogs or bicycles. I walked slowly toward a small inn I had found in a brochure months earlier. The woman at the desk smiled warmly and showed me to a modest room overlooking a courtyard of hibiscus and palms. I set my bags down and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant sound of gulls. That evening, I walked to the boardwalk and stood looking out at the ocean. The sun was sinking, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and violet. Couples strolled past me, children licked melting ice cream cones, the world around me, moving without knowledge of the quiet revolution taking place in my heart. I pulled my sweater tighter and felt a calm settle over me. For the first time in years, I had stepped away not out of defeat, but by choice. When I returned to my room, I unpacked only the essentials, leaving one suitcase closed by the wall. I placed Robert's watch on the nightstand, the quilt folded at the end of the bed, and a framed photo of Emma and Luke on the dresser. These small pieces of home were enough to remind me who I was and what I was fighting to preserve. The phone remained off in my purse, heavy but silent. I knew the messages were still piling up, Lauren's fury growing by the hour, Daniel's confusion feeding into it. But none of that reached me here. The walls of the inn were thin, but they held strong enough to keep their voices out. I lay down and listened to the faint hum of traffic, the laughter drifting from a nearby restaurant, and beyond it all the steady pulse of the ocean. My life had shifted on its axis. The house was no longer theirs to covet. It was no longer even mine to cling to. It was a closed chapter. Ahead of me stretched something unknown, but finally chosen. Sleep came easily, carried on the sound of waves I could not yet see but already felt in my bones. The first weeks in Wilmington felt like stepping into a life I had forgotten was possible. I found a small cottage painted pale yellow just 2 blocks from the water. The porch sagged slightly, but when the sea breeze drifted through the windows, it carried with it the sound of gulls and the smell of salt. Each morning I walked along the boardwalk, letting the rhythm of the waves steady my breath, and in the afternoons I unpacked slowly, making the little cottage my own. It was at the community center that I met Gloria. She was a retired art teacher with silver hair tied neatly in a bun and paint stains on her hands that never seemed to wash out. She coaxed me into joining her watercolor class despite my protests that I had not painted since high school. Sitting at a table with brushes and paper in front of me, I felt both foolish and alive. The first strokes were shaky, but Gloria only laughed, telling me that hesitation was the enemy of art. I began to look forward to those classes, the quiet focus, the splash of color on blank paper, the way it pulled me out of my head. A few days later on my morning walk, I stopped at a small bookstore tucked between a coffee shop and a florist. The scent of paper and cedar filled the air. Behind the counter stood Henry, a man with kind eyes and the gentle weariness of someone who had known loss. He was a widower, as I later learned, who had run the store for decades. He recommended a book of coastal history, and when I hesitated, he added softly that it paired well with the sound of the ocean at night. We spoke for a while about authors we loved, and before I left, he asked if I might come back for the book club that met on Thursdays. His invitation felt less like obligation and more like the opening of a door. Day by day, I built small routines. I baked bread in the cottage kitchen, walked to the pier to watch fishermen cast their lines, joined Gloria for coffee after class, and began leaving notes in the margins of books Henry pressed into my hands. For the first time in years, I was living for myself, not for the demands of others. One late afternoon, while I was rinsing paintbrushes in the sink, the phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the screen showed Ruth's name. My heart quickened as I answered. Her voice was brisk, but warm. "Margaret, it is done. The house sold above asking price. The funds have already been transferred into the trust." I gripped the edge of the counter, dizzy with relief. "Thank you, Ruth." "There is more," she continued after a pause. "Daniel and Lauren know now. They are furious. Daniel has called my office 3 times today demanding explanations. Lauren left messages threatening legal action. I have everything documented so they cannot touch you, but be prepared. They will not take this quietly." I felt the blood drain from my face. The little cottage around me suddenly felt both like a sanctuary and a fragile shell. Ruth must have sensed the silence on my end because her tone softened. "You are safe, Margaret. You made the right choice. Do not let their anger undo your peace." After we hung up, I walked out onto the porch. The evening sky was streaked with pink and orange, the sea breeze cool against my skin. Children rode bicycles down the street, their laughter floating on the air. Life here moved gently untouched by the storm that was brewing hundreds of miles away in Raleigh. Yet I could feel the tension creeping in a shadow at the edges of my calm. That night, I left the phone on the dresser, the screen dark, but sleep came fitfully. I dreamed of Daniel as a boy, his small hand clutching mine as we crossed a busy street, only to have that hand slip away into silence. I woke before dawn, the quilt damp beneath my palms, the sound of the ocean muffled through the windows. In the morning, I tried to shake the unease by joining Gloria at her class. She greeted me with her usual cheer, sliding a jar of fresh flowers onto the table where I worked. Yet my brush trembled, colors bleeding together. She placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and kind. "You are carrying something heavy," she said simply. I nodded but did not explain. Later that day, I returned to Henry's store. He was shelving new arrivals, his dog dozing near the door. He noticed the tension in my face and asked if I was all right. I told him only that family matters had followed me here, even though I had hoped to leave them behind. He nodded knowingly, not pressing, and slid a novel across the counter. For nights when the past tries to knock too loudly, he said. I walked back to the cottage with the book under my arm, the ocean breeze stronger now. Inside, I boiled water for tea and sat at the small table. Ruth's words replayed in my head. They are furious. They will not take this quietly. The trust was secure, the house no longer theirs to covet, but anger had a way of finding cracks. I sipped my tea, the steam rising, and listened to the distant sound of gulls. The life I had begun here was fragile tender as the watercolor flowers drying on my easel. I knew the storm was not finished. As the sun dipped low, I stepped outside and looked toward the horizon where the ocean met the sky. The waves rolled steady, indifferent to my fears. I wrapped my sweater tight around me and whispered a promise to myself. I had chosen this path. I would not turn back now. The cottage glowed with lamplight as I went inside my steps, slow but firm. I closed the door behind me, aware that peace and conflict now lived side by side in my life. The night stretched ahead, carrying both comfort and the warning of what was to come. 3 weeks later, the storm finally broke. I was rinsing teacups in the cottage kitchen when the first vibration rattled my phone on the counter. Then another, then a flood that would not stop. I turned the screen over and saw the stack of missed calls, Daniel's name flashing again and again. When I opened the message folder, it showed more than 200 texts, all piling one over the other like debris after a flood. The voicemails were no better. I pressed play on the first and heard Lauren's clipped tone, cold and furious. "You cannot do this without consulting us. That house was supposed to be part of our future." Her voice cracked on the last word, but there was no grief in it, only outrage. The next message was Daniel, his voice strained and ragged. "Mom, you have destroyed everything. We had plans. Do you even understand what you have done?" I listened quietly, my hand steady despite the storm pouring into my ears. I did not delete them. I let them play one by one, Lauren's fury mixing with Daniel's desperation. Each message confirmed what I had known all along. They never saw the house as mine. To them, it had always been a piece on a game board waiting to be claimed. When Ruth called later that afternoon, her tone was brisk but steady. "They contacted me already, Margaret. Daniel demanded we void the sale. Lauren threatened lawsuits. I told them everything was filed properly, witnessed, notarized. The deed transfer is final. The trust is secure." I thanked her, though my voice shook. "Ruth, are they going to keep pushing?" "They may try," she said, "but they have no ground. Their anger is loud, but it has no teeth." After we hung up, I set the phone down and walked out onto the porch. The sky above Wilmington was overcast, the breeze sharper than usual. Children rode bicycles past my cottage, unaware of the storm that raged hundreds of miles away and still reached me through wires and screens. That evening, I powered the phone back on to check again. The screen lit up with the final tally: 135 missed calls, 253 messages. The numbers blurred before my eyes. I scrolled through them, catching words like betrayal, selfish, heartless. Then one message froze me. "Emma needs to know why you are doing this. How could you hurt your grandchildren like this?" I closed my eyes and gripped the phone hard. They had dragged the children into it now. The anger that rose in me was no longer just sadness. It was fury, sharp and cold. I had set up the trust for Emma and Luke to protect them, to give them something untangled from their parents' greed. And now Daniel and Lauren twisted it into cruelty, making it sound as though I had abandoned them. Late into the night, the calls continued, each vibration a reminder of how deeply the letter had cut. Lauren had promised contractors remodel work. She must have told friends about the new design. She had planned the kitchen she had already claimed in her imagination. All of it dissolved the moment she read my letter. Daniel had built financial plans on the assumption that my home would be collateral, his safety net waiting for him. That net had vanished. The cottage was quiet except for the steady crash of waves in the distance. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and sat by the window watching the moonlight stretch across the water. The phone sat silent on the table, its screen dark at last. Their anger could no longer reach me here. In the morning, Gloria knocked at my door holding a sketchbook under her arm. "You missed class," she said gently. "Is everything all right?" I almost told her the whole truth, but instead, I smiled faintly. "Family matters," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Come when you can. The colors wait for you." When she left, I sat at the table with my untouched brushes. My phone buzzed once more, a single voicemail left after a gap of silence. Daniel's voice was hoarse, barely controlled. "Mom, you destroyed the plan. Do you hear me? You ruined everything." I let the message end the cottage, filling again with the sound of waves through the open window. I picked up the brush and dipped it into blue paint, letting the color bleed across the paper. My hand no longer trembled. I knew now that the letter had struck exactly where it was meant to. The storm had come loud and violent, but I remained standing. It was a gray morning when I saw him step out of a car on the boardwalk. Daniel looked older than his years, the shirt wrinkled his jaw unshaven, his eyes scanning the cafe until they landed on me. For a moment, I almost did not recognize him. He had always carried himself with a certain confidence, but now his shoulders slumped, his face drawn. He walked toward my table, his steps quick, his expression a mixture of anger and something I could not yet name. He sat down hard across from me without waiting for an invitation. "Mom, you have no idea what you've done." His voice was low but sharp. "You ruined everything we planned." I set my coffee cup down and looked at him steadily. "What exactly did I ruin, Daniel?" "We were going to use the house to secure a loan. I had plans. I was working with contractors lined up. You destroyed all of it." The words stung not for their content, but for the way he said them. Not one mention of Robert, of the years of sacrifice it took to build that home. Not one acknowledgement that it had never been his. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "That house was mine, Daniel. I paid every bill for 43 years. I kept it after your father died. It was never yours to claim." His mouth opened, then shut again. He gripped the edge of the table as though holding on for balance. "You don't understand," he said finally. "We needed that security." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the folder I had kept carefully for years. One by one, I opened photographs of wrapped gifts, birthday cards with my handwriting receipts, showing items mailed to Emma and Luke. I pushed the phone across the table. "Look at these," I said quietly. He frowned, picking up the phone, his thumb swiping through the pictures. I watched his expression change from irritation to confusion, then to something closer to disbelief. He lingered on the photo of a watercolor set I had mailed to Emma, the very one she had once told me never arrived. He tapped the screen, his voice uncertain. "Mom, she said you forgot. She said nothing ever came." I nodded slowly. "Lauren told you that. And you believed her." His face tightened, eyes narrowing as he scrolled further. There were photos of Christmas gifts, birthday packages, even the small trinkets I had sent when I traveled. All recorded, all kept, because somewhere deep down, I knew the truth would matter one day. He set the phone down, staring past me out at the gray waves. His jaw worked as though he were chewing words too bitter to swallow. "Why didn't you say something?" he muttered. "I did, Daniel. You never listened." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clatter of dishes from the cafe, the gulls crying overhead, the hiss of the ocean all filled the silence between us. I studied my son's face, the boy I had once carried to Little League games, the young man I had worked 2 jobs to put through college. He looked back at me now with eyes that finally seemed to see me not as an obstacle, but as a person. His voice cracked when he spoke again. "I thought you were pulling away from us, Mom. I thought you stopped caring." My throat ached, but I held his gaze. "No, Daniel. I never stopped caring. I was erased piece by piece until even you could not see me." He pushed the phone back across the table and rubbed his hands over his face. "I should have known." I took a breath, steady but tired. "What you should have known is that your wife was isolating me. She made sure I was invisible even to you." The muscles in his jaw twitched. His eyes glistened, but he blinked hard, pushing the emotion down. I could see the fight between anger and shame playing out behind his silence. Finally, he stood the chair, scraping against the wooden floor. "I have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. I watched him walk out of the cafe, his shoulders hunched, his stride uneven. At the door, he paused, glancing back at me. Our eyes met, and for the briefest second, I saw something I had been waiting for years to see: regret. Then he turned and walked into the gray morning, leaving me with the steady crash of waves and the cooling coffee in my cup. I sat still, knowing nothing had been fixed, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, the truth had found its way through. 2 mornings later, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. I was pruning roses in the small garden outside the cottage when a silver SUV came to a sharp stop at the curb. Lauren stepped out, sunglasses perched on her face, every line of her posture radiating fury. She did not bother to close the car door before she strode through the gate. Her heels clicked against the path as she came closer. "That letter," she spat, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That letter destroyed our future. You had no right." I set the clippers down slowly and removed my gloves. My voice stayed calm. "Inheritance is not a right, Lauren. It is a gift, and gifts are tied to respect." She ripped the sunglasses from her face, her eyes blazing. "Respect. Is that what you call abandoning your son and grandchildren? You are selfish. You think of no one but yourself." I felt the sting of her words, but let them pass like the sea wind. "Selfish is what you call it when I stop being used." For years I cooked your meals, babysat your children, covered your holidays. Not once did you say thank you without expecting more. Her face twisted, the fury growing sharper. "We had plans. That house was supposed to secure everything. Do you know how much time I put into preparing the remodel? Do you know the promises I made?" I met her gaze squarely. "Those promises were never yours to make. That house was not yours." She stepped closer, lowering her voice, but sharpening it further. "You will regret this. We will take you to court. We will prove you are not in your right mind." For the first time since she arrived, I felt a small smile tug at my lips. Ruth anticipated that. I had full medical evaluations, multiple witnesses, and notarized documents. Every choice I made was deliberate. Every decision signed in clarity. "You can try, Lauren, but you will waste your money and lose." For a heartbeat, she faltered, her eyes flickering with something like doubt. Then the anger surged back. "You want to play this game? Fine, but you have turned your own son against you." I shook my head slowly. "No, Lauren, I only held up the mirror. What he chooses to see now is not my doing." She inhaled sharply, as if my words had struck deeper than she expected. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the shore. "You always thought you were better than me," she snapped, "with your quiet little dignity and your smug smiles. But look at you, alone in a cottage clinging to scraps of a life you barely have left." I felt the words like stones hurled at me, but I did not flinch. Alone, yes, but at peace, which is more than I can say for you. For the first time, her voice cracked. "You ruined everything. No, Lauren, I protected myself, and I protected Emma and Luke. One day they will understand." Her lips parted as if to throw more fire, but nothing came. She turned sharply, her heels striking the path like hammer blows. She yanked open the car door, tossed her sunglasses onto the seat, and slammed it shut hard enough to rattle the windows of my cottage. I stood in the garden watching as the SUV roared away, dust rising behind it. My heart pounded not from fear, but from the release of years of silence. I bent to pick up the clippers I had dropped, the roses swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. Inside the cottage felt calmer than before, as though the walls themselves recognized a battle had been fought and won. I poured a glass of water and sat by the window. The ocean lay steady in the distance, indifferent to storms of human anger. I let the quiet fill me, knowing the worst of Lauren's rage had been spent, and yet aware she was not finished. I leaned back in my chair, the glass cool in my hand, and for the first time since leaving Raleigh, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Lauren's fury had come and gone like a summer storm, violent but brief. The real work of rebuilding for both of us was only beginning. The first days of July carried with them the hum of cicadas and the heavy scent of salt drifting in from the Atlantic. I had just pulled a pie from the oven when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped, knowing who it must be. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door just in time to see Emma and Luke tumble out of the back seat, their small suitcases trailing behind them. Emma reached me first, her arms flung tight around my waist, her face pressed against my shoulder. "Grandma," she sobbed, "we thought you didn't want us anymore." Luke clung to my side, his eyes shining with tears he was too proud to let fall. For a long moment, I simply held them, breathing in the scent of sunscreen and shampoo, my chest aching with the relief of having them back in my arms. When they finally loosened their grip, Emma looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "Mom told us you forgot us. She said you didn't send presents or call because you didn't care." Her voice cracked on the last word. Luke added quietly, "She told people you were never coming back." I knelt down, cupping their faces in my hands. Sweethearts, none of that was true. Every year I sent cards and gifts. Every holiday I thought of you first. I have proof of all of it, pictures and receipts. It was never me forgetting. Emma's lips trembled. Then why would she say that? Because sometimes people try to control the story, I said softly, but the truth always finds its way. And now you know the truth. Inside the cottage, I sliced warm apple pie and placed the plates in front of them. Luke's eyes brightened at the first bite, his shoulders relaxing, as if the taste itself carried him back to happier times. Emma leaned her elbows on the table, her voice still small. "I missed this so much, Grandma. I missed you." We spent the afternoon walking down to the beach, the waves rolling in steady and sure. Luke raced ahead, his laughter carried by the wind, while Emma walked beside me, her hand in mine. The gulls wheeled above, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Later, as the children dozed on the porch swing, my phone buzzed in the kitchen. The screen showed Daniel's name. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but something in me knew I had to answer. His voice when it came was rough, not with anger, but with something heavier. "Mom, I need to say this. That letter, it destroyed the plans Lauren and I made. You blew it apart." His words faltered, then grew quieter, but it also opened my eyes. I closed my eyes, my throat tight. "Daniel, I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to protect myself and the children." "I know," he whispered. "I see it now. I saw the gifts, the cards. I found them hidden away. I cannot believe I doubted you for so long." Tears slid down my cheeks silently as I leaned against the counter. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and apples, the sounds of the children breathing softly on the porch. For the first time since leaving Raleigh, I felt justice settle like a weight lifted from my shoulders. Daniel's voice cracked again. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom, but I want to try." I swallowed hard, my tears blurring the cottage walls around me. "That is all I ever wanted," I said. "For you to see me." The line was quiet for a moment, filled only with his unsteady breath. Then he said softly, "Thank you for not giving up completely." When the call ended, I stood still, the phone warm in my hand, my cheeks wet. The storm had not ended, but for the first time, I felt the first light breaking through. I stepped back onto the porch, gathering Emma and Luke into my arms, breathing in the summer air and knowing that the truth had begun to do its work. A year slipped by, quietly marked not by arguments or slammed doors, but by the steady rhythm of the sea outside my window. On the morning of my 67th birthday, I stepped barefoot onto the porch of my yellow cottage and breathed in the fragrance of blooming roses and jasmine from the garden I had planted with my own hands. Sunlight spilled across the wooden boards, and for the first time in decades, my birthday felt like a celebration of life rather than a reminder of obligations. Inside, the walls were no longer bare. They held watercolor paintings from my classes, some simple flowers, others seascapes that captured the shifting moods of the Atlantic. They were not perfect, but they were mine, and each brush stroke reminded me that I had chosen this life with courage. Henry came by often, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, sometimes with his golden retriever tugging at the leash. We had fallen into an easy companionship, sharing coffee on the porch or walking to the bookstore together. He never pressed for more than I could give, and yet I found myself looking forward to his presence, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he laughed at my shy attempts at humor. Emma and Luke had arrived a week earlier to spend 2 weeks of their summer with me. Their laughter filled the cottage, bouncing off the walls like sunlight. Emma painted beside me at the table, her brush steady and confident, while Luke insisted on helping me bake apple pies, his face dusted with flour as he measured sugar with exaggerated seriousness. In the evenings, we walked along the shore, their feet sinking into the wet sand, their hands clutching mine as the waves lapped at our ankles. Daniel came down on weekends, his visits tentative at first, then steadier as the months went by. He looked healthier, the sharp edge of guilt softening into something quieter. He had filed for divorce, and though the process had been bitter, it was also a release. He spoke less about the plans that had once consumed him, and more about the simple routines of work and parenting. Sometimes when he watched Emma and Luke run across the beach toward me, his eyes filled with something like shame and gratitude all at once. Lauren's name rarely came up anymore, though I heard enough to know her reputation had crumbled in Raleigh. Friends stopped inviting her clients, turned to other realtors, and her voice no longer carried the authority it once did. She had sown distrust, and now it followed her. I felt no triumph in that, only a deep weariness. She had spent years tearing at the fabric of my family, and in the end she was left unraveling alone. That evening, Emma insisted we have a birthday dinner in the garden. Luke helped Daniel string lights along the porch rail, and Gloria arrived with a bouquet of sunflowers. Henry came carrying a basket of fresh bread from the bakery, his smile warm as ever. We ate outside, the air filled with the scent of grilled vegetables and the sound of the children's laughter. After cake and candles, Emma surprised me with a drawing. It was of the cottage painted in bright colors, with me standing on the porch holding a watering can. Above it, she had written in careful letters, "Grandma's house." My throat tightened as I studied the picture. It was not the big Raleigh home Robert and I had built, the house Lauren had plotted to claim. It was this little cottage by the sea, filled with flowers, paintings, friends, and the children who still ran into my arms without hesitation. When the evening quieted and the children went inside, Daniel lingered on the porch. He shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Mom, I cannot change what I allowed. But I want you to know I see you now. I see everything you carried, and I am sorry." I reached out and took his hand, the same hand I had once held crossing busy streets when he was small. "We cannot rewrite the past, Daniel, but we can choose what comes next." He nodded, his eyes damp in the glow of the porch lights. Later that night, as the house settled into silence, I sat alone for a moment beneath the stars. The ocean roared softly in the distance, steady and eternal. I thought of the letter I had left on that dining table in Raleigh, the words that had torn through their plans and set me free. It had been more than a legal document. It had been my voice sharpened by years of silence, finally heard. That letter had destroyed their scheme, yes, but it had given me back more than walls and money. It had returned my freedom, my dignity, and the chance to live the life I had once thought was gone forever. As I closed the door and turned off the lights, I whispered a quiet thank you to Robert, to myself, to the courage it had taken to walk away. Tomorrow would bring more simple days, more walks on the shore, more laughter in the cottage. And that was enough. If you felt something in my story, if you saw a part of yourself in my struggle and my choice to rise again, I would love to know. Share your thoughts. Share your own stories of courage, and stay with me here. There are more voices like mine waiting to be heard.